Thank you very much, Professor Kim Jae-won, for the kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to begin by thanking Director On and Professor Kim Jae-won for inviting me to speak to you this morning. And thank you all for joining. And I realize I'm speaking to you right before lunch, so I'll try my best to make it exciting and make it hopefully an appetizer for your lunch. I would do my best to also match up with Dr. Kim's prior presentation. What I would like to talk to you about is innovation in mobility. To do that, I want to first begin by defining the challenges that we face today. So living in Korea, I think many of you may be concerned about air pollution. So I moved to Seoul a couple of years ago, and I realized checking the PM2.5, the misemonji level every morning is quite important. The second issue is congestion. Now Korean congestion is relatively good. The picture I'm showing you here, this is from Hanoi. But if you look around the world, most urban centers suffer from significant amounts of traffic congestion. And the last one is energy security. This picture might be a little bit less obvious. This is a refinery fire a couple of years ago in Texas. The entire energy for road transport, the supply chain from production of oil down to retail of gasoline is susceptible to energy security. These are the challenges that we think about today. I want to ask you to think back. Imagine you were living in the world at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century, so exactly 121 years ago. Back in 1898, the first International Urban Planning Conference took place in New York. And they were talking about the biggest challenge they were facing in mobility. Anyone have a guess what was the issue that they were dealing with in 1898? Any idea? What was the biggest problem with mobility at that time? Any guesses? Yes. You're absolutely right. I don't know if, so thank you for the right answer. I think you're the first person I've heard actually know the answer when I've asked this question. So in 1898, at this conference, the biggest topic they were talking about was horse manure. And I do apologize bringing this up right before lunch. Of course, human beings had been using horses to move for thousands of years. But what happened was in the 1800s, as cities developed, the reliance on using horses for transporting people and goods significantly increased to the point that by the latter half of the 1800s, the amount of horse manure that was being generated in cities like London and New York, they were a significant public health issue. In 1894, the Times of London ran an article predicting that by 1950, every street in London would be buried in 3 meters of horse manure. And the problem with horse manure was, of course, this was not only a nuisance, it was blocking access, it was also creating a lot of disease. So it was actually impacting people's lifetime. They hosted this conference in 1898. The conference was supposed to last 10 days. And by the third day, they gave up. They basically said, we don't have a solution. But that was kind of ironic because they actually did have a solution. There was a technology already invented more than 10 years before which could have solved this issue. So Carl Benz, the famous Mercedes-Benz that you know now, he started selling cars in 1885. He actually demonstrated the first internal combustion engine vehicle 6 years earlier, New Year's Eve in 1879. He invented the car, and then of course Henry Ford then invented the production line in 1908 with the Model T. And if you look at how the uptake of cars took place, in 1900, this picture that you see here, this is Manhattan in New York City, there were still more horse-drawn carriages than cars. You can't really see the car in this picture, there's one. In 1900, in the United States, all of the US, 4,000 cars were sold. A decade later, almost 400,000 cars were sold. And in cities like New York, you basically went from 0 cars to almost 100% cars. Now, to be fair, this transition takes a lot of time, and I will come back to this topic later on. But what I wanted to point out is, going back to the problem definition, about just 15 years earlier than 1913, people were really, really worried about horse manure. They were thinking, like, we can't do anything about this. And almost overnight, you had this technology that basically solved the problem. Now, of course, this technology has introduced the other problems that I mentioned at the beginning. Now, what are we trying to do now to solve the problems that we are facing? The same company that invented the car is now trying to invent a solution with CASE. To be fair, this idea of using connected autonomous shared and electric platforms is not just limited to Daimler. Daimler was the first company to coin the term, but if you go around and look at all presentations by automakers around the world, if you look at Hyundai, if you look at BMW, BMW actually uses the same letters, just in a different order. They call it ACES. But if you look at Hyundai, if you look at GM, if you look at Ford, if you look at Toyota, all companies are now talking about, let's change the drivetrain. Maybe the power will come from battery or fuel cell, but let's change the drivetrain so it'll be cleaner. And then let's use connectivity, autonomy, and sharing to tackle those questions around congestion. Now, on the point of electric vehicles, actually, they've been around for almost 200 years. So the first electric car was actually demonstrated before the internal combustion engine. It was demonstrated in the 1830s. The picture I put up here, this is actually a production-ready electric car in 1881. If you remember the Carl Benz car that I showed you, that was actually 1885. So you've had electric cars around a lot longer. And by 1900, there were already 30,000 electric cars around the world. There were actually more electric cars than internal combustion engine. And taxi services actually in London and New York first started using electric cars than internal combustion engine. People liked cars more in the beginning because they were quieter and they were safer to use, particularly with internal combustion engine vehicles. You may have seen in the old movies, you had to use these cranking handles to start them. And these handles, they were a huge safety risk because when you were turning them around, as the engine would start, there was a lot of a back kick, and all of a sudden the handle would turn on itself, and many people lost their thumbs because of this. But there was a challenge with the electric cars. The first issue was you couldn't refuel them that fast. It took a lot of time to charge them. And those of you working on electric vehicles today, you may think that, oh, this is sort of deja vu. This is a topic that we still talk about today. When electric pumps were invented for pumping gasoline, it made fueling internal combustion engine much easier and much faster. And also, the range of the vehicles were longer. The other issue was the production methods for electric cars never scaled, whereas Henry Ford used production lines for internal combustion engine and managed to achieve cheaper production costs quite quickly. The last issue that really killed the electric car and led to domination of internal combustion engine for over 100 years actually came from the electric car itself. It was invention of electric starter motors. Remember I told you about the handle, the cranking handle that you had to use for starting the internal combustion engine? When people realized, hey, wait a minute, we could use an electric motor to do that, this really changed the game. This made the internal combustion engine vehicle a lot safer, a lot easier to use. The first patent for electric starter motors were actually around 1903, and then by around 1912 you had production-ready cars, and by 1920s most of the cars were using them. The reason I bring this up is sometimes innovation is about recognizing some other technology in another sector and applying it to your area. It's not always about inventing something completely brand new. And of course, as the adoption of internal combustion engine vehicles increased, this really led to the downfall of electric cars. Now, why are we talking about electric cars today again? What is the innovation that brought the electric car back again? Many of you, I think, already know the answer. It's better batteries. So a couple of weeks ago, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was announced, and it was awarded to the 3 gentlemen that are responsible for the lithium-ion battery. The person in the middle, Stanley Whittingham, in 1970s, he discovered that you could use titanium disulfide as a cathode for intercalating lithium. The big difference with other battery technologies was that in other battery technologies like lead-acid batteries, you have a full electrochemical reaction taking place. That reaction can be slightly slow, so it means it has low power density, but also the amount of energy that you can store is quite limited. With intercalation processes, you can do that reaction a lot faster. That means you can achieve a higher power density. After he discovered this, John Goodenough was looking at his research, and he postulated that actually if you change the material from metal disulfides to metal oxides, like cobalt oxide, that energy capacity can be significantly increased. And he demonstrated that. He developed a better cathode in early 1980s. But the problem with both what the work that Stanley Whittingham and John Goodenough had done was they were using lithium metal as the anode. And lithium, as some of you may be aware, is actually highly reactive with air and moisture. It's highly unstable. So it was very hard for them to make a safe battery that you could package and use in consumer application. In early 1980s, to be exact 1985, Akira Yoshino came around and he actually postulated that instead of lithium metal, if you take that lithium and mix it with carbon-based materials such as petroleum coke in his case, essentially different types of graphitic material, you can make a stable anode for lithium-ion batteries. And once he discovered that phenomena, then he worked with his company Asahi Kasei and Sony, and by 1991 they commercialized that technology. Lithium-ion batteries on energy density, power density, and the cycle life on that combination, they ended up beating the existing battery technologies, and they powered the mobile revolution that we benefit from. If you look at all the modern EVs today, they all use lithium-ion batteries. And the innovation, particularly for Tesla, was Tesla actually, so what Elon Musk and J.B. Struble decided to do was they said, why don't we just take the consumer-grade lithium-ion batteries and try to make a battery pack big enough to power an EV. When they were doing that, a lot of people ridiculed them because they said, you're going to take thousands of cells, wire them up to get the tens of kilowatt hours of energy capacity that you need to power an electric car. Many things can go wrong with this, and actually they still managed to demonstrate that you could do this. The other companies, the automakers, of course, started to develop their own EVs. They all started with specialized lithium-ion battery cell design. That meant that on a cost basis, their packs were still more expensive than Tesla's. Today, now, it's a lot more competitive, but actually, I'll talk about this a little bit later on. In the early days of EVs, for the first 5 years, Tesla's battery packs were still cheaper than what the big companies were doing because Tesla decided that why don't we use what was consumer-ready batteries and try to do that, try to develop a pack that way. We already have 6 million electric vehicles on the road. As I mentioned earlier, the first EVs went on sale at the end of 2010, if you look at the Nissan Leaf and the GM Volt. So it's been quite a remarkable growth. And I'm talking about only passenger electric vehicles here. If you add buses and commercial vehicles, that number will be 6.5 million. And then if you start including electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers or even electric bicycles, then we're talking an order of magnitude larger than that. What this rapid growth has done is bring the average price of batteries down. as this industry has scaled, we have seen 85% reduction in the average EV lithium-ion battery pack price. Of course, the industry benefited even back in 2010, the starting point, they benefited with the existing lithium-ion battery supply chain that existed for the mobile consumer technology. Going forward, we expect by around 2024, you're going to get to prices below $100 per kilowatt hour. And that $100 per kilowatt hour is the threshold that's usually considered for having electric vehicles become cheap enough on an upfront basis to match internal combustion engine. Now, to be fair, there are many different sizes of cars, and pricing of cars work out differently in each market. So we actually expect that as early as 2022, in certain segments, in certain markets, you'll be able to go to a dealership, buy an EV without any subsidies at a comparable price to an internal combustion engine, and still the automaker would be able to make similar margin. And this will improve over time as the batteries get cheaper, and that by early 2030s, you're going to be able to have in all markets across all segments EVs that are affordable as internal combustion engine. This means we're going to go from the 2 million EVs that were sold last year to 10 million by 2025 and to over 50 million by 2040. Now, some of you may be wondering, if the EVs are becoming that cheap, why are not we getting to 100% right away? One of the issues with that is actually charging infrastructure. We still have to solve that, and there are a lot of opportunities for new innovation. I think one of those is actually coming out of KAIST. Professor Kim Jae-woon's dynamic wireless charging could be one of those. Providing access to charging is still an issue. If you live in an apartment building where you're sharing access to the parking lot, resolving how you're going to install charge points there is not just a technology issue, but it also requires policy considerations. So one of the challenges with innovation is, even if you have the best technology, if on the policy side there are not regulatory reforms, that can be challenging in terms of scaling up the technology. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time talking about EVs. What about the rest of CASE? Now, the concept of CASE has actually been around for quite a lot of time if you recognize it. So all these monorails that you see in these pictures, they're all electric, they're all autonomous, they don't have a driver, they rely on connectivity to be driven, and they're all a shared platform. Now, the problem with all of these, of course, is that you're not going to be able to deploy a monorail everywhere. You have to have the space for it, and also it requires a lot of money to deploy these. So the whole concept of CASE is, how can we repackage these monorails in a form that you can deploy them anywhere? And the answer to that question is about connectivity. Now, why do I bring up connectivity? You have to recognize how the cellular phone revolution is really driving the mobility evolution. And on that note, I want to go back. I think many of you are too young to remember some of these phones. So the first phone that had internet access or a graphical web browser was actually sold commercially in 1996. This was the Nokia Communication 9000. If you go around the industry, some may debate and they may say that the IBM Simon, which was commercialized in 1994, was really the first smartphone. But the Nokia Communication 9000 was the one that had a graphic web browser. The first phone that had GPS that consumers could buy was a Benefin Scape. I think most of you would not even know what their brand name is, Benefin. It's a Finnish company that's still around, although it doesn't sell cell phones anymore. So in 1999, they actually started selling phones that had GPS built in. And then, of course, you had Apple come out with the iPhone in January 2007, and then less than a year later, you had the Android OS come to market. With Nokia phone, we first got the internet connectivity. With this phone from Benephone, we added the GPS connectivity. But what iOS and Android really did is provide a platform where not only you had internet connectivity and GPS, but you had the ability to develop apps that consumers could use. And those apps were not limited to just the company making the phone. It could be third-party developers. Keep in mind this 2007-2008 date, and think about the different elements of case. Anytime you're using Kakao Taxi, you're relying on your cell phone. Kakao Taxi or Uber or Lyft or Didi or any of these apps, they would not be possible without the phone that has internet connectivity and GPS. But also, it probably would have not been invented if the phone was limited to the phone manufacturer. If you think about the Kakao Taxi app, that wasn't invented by Samsung Electronics or LG, right? It was Kakao. Or if you go as far back and think about Uber, it wasn't invented by a phone handset manufacturer, right? So that ability of third-party developers to develop software for phones is quite critical. For electric vehicles, solving the charging infrastructure challenge, again, is heavily reliant on connectivity, enabling the car and the consumer knowing where there's available charging and then when to charge requires connectivity. Even the battery development process is really dependent on connectivity. One of the things that all the EV developers have been doing, whether it's Nissan or whether it's Tesla, they're actually collecting data on the performance of the battery pack via the telematics chip that's in the car and using that data to improve the battery management software. And when we talk about autonomy, for autonomy to develop the high definition maps that the autonomous cars need to have to know where they are, you need to rely on connectivity, but you can also use connectivity as a perception sensor to help the car know what it cannot see with its physical sensors. Now, a little bit more on each of these elements. The first digital hailing apps, so taxi hailing and ride hailing, both of them were invented came to market in 2009. So Uber started in 2009. My Taxi, which was a German taxi hailing app, also came in 2009. The main reason they came out 2009, it goes back to that 2007, 2008 date around iOS and Android. By 2009, you had a large enough consumer base having smartphones that then you could have these companies provide an app to serve them mobility needs. And over that period of time, we have seen these sort of apps mushroom all around the world. I stopped it at 2017 because if you put the 2018 one, unfortunately, you can't see the rest of it. There's too many of them now. What's even more remarkable is by now, there are over 1 billion users of digital hailing apps around the world. So in less than 10 years, we now have 1 billion users of these services. 1 billion is quite a remarkable number if you recognize that to have these apps, you actually have to be an adult. So if you think about the world's population, if you look at just the adult population, this already represents 25% of the world population using smartphones for mobility services. And if you look at Korea and the innovative mobility companies that have come out recently, they all rely on these smartphone services. Now, unfortunately, some of you who follow the news also will recognize that all these companies, with the exception of SOCAR, that's doing quite well, both Tada and Pulas have faced challenges, not because of technology, but because of regulation. Again, what I'm trying to point out is, if you have an innovative, brilliant idea, don't forget the political challenges that you might face. Remember that you may need to actually build up key support, not just from a technological perspective, but from the perspective of having political support to make sure that your business model will succeed. Now, what is the role of these shared mobility services going forward. At my company, we spend a lot of time trying to predict the future. And to predict the future, we also spend a lot of time looking at the past. So one of the things that we try to do in predicting the future is figure out, if you look at demand for mobility by cars today, how much of that is right now being addressed by these shared mobility services? So last year, in 2018, globally, if you looked at the distance that was driven by cars all around the world, that was roughly 15 trillion kilometers. Of that 15 trillion kilometers, about 5% of it was in shared modes. So things like taxis or carpooling applications or car sharing. By 2040, we expect demand for mobility will reach about 28 trillion kilometers. And within that, we expect about 22% of the share will be addressed by these new shared modes. What that means is, even though demand will grow by about 80%, you need to only grow the car fleet by about 45%. So this helps a little bit with the congestion. Now, this is an economic model. If you have policy interventions, you can actually optimize this even more. The problem right now is, in most places, we are not seeing those policy interventions. If anything, in some places like Korea, we see the policies inadvertently holding back the potential growth of these shared services. Now, some of you may be wondering what that AV means. So the AV here is the level 4 autonomy. For level 4 autonomy, as the chart shows, we're still relatively conservative on the expected impact. If we zoom that up, today you have a lot of test cars, and in some cases like Waymo and soon GM Cruise, they've also eliminated the human backup driver. So Waymo already is driving some cars where there's no human in it, and they're already providing a commercial service in parts of Arizona. That we expect to gradually grow. And the main reason we may seem a bit conservative on this one is the technology still have a lot of issues, particularly on the safety side. And this graph will be slightly tricky to explain, but I'll try to do that in a short time. If you think about autonomy, for the average consumer to accept autonomous vehicles, they will have to be a lot safer than existing human drivers. Society will not accept if you have the same accident rate as human drivers, because people expect them to be safer. If you think about airplanes, the safety statistics for airplanes is roughly 100,000 times better human-driven cars. So if you think about the number of people that die of airplane accidents, it's significantly lower than the number of people that every day die from traffic accidents. Now, I'm not trying to make a scientific point here. This is unfortunately a point around our inability for risk perception, basically. We expect airplanes to be a lot safer than cars that we drive. Many of you that drive, you probably think you're a very safe driver. Statistics might think differently. So the problem is with autonomous vehicles, people will expect autonomous vehicles to achieve safety rates similar to airplanes that rely on autopilot. And that means the statistics that we have today have to get at least 2 order magnitudes better. What I'm showing you here, these are the publicly disclosed statistics around testing of autonomous vehicles in California. And without going to details, it shows that for Waymo, which is the best case, and GM Cruise, that's the second case, you gotta get close to this, and this is missing a decimal point here, this is 0.01. You gotta get closer to that point before the companies will be comfortable in making these available to consumers, and that's gonna take a bit of more time. But of course, that's a lot of opportunity for innovation. So autonomy will take a little bit of time. But we should also remember case is not just about cars. If you've ever ridden a shared electric scooter or an electric bicycle, these are also other modes that are electrified, they're relying on connectivity, and they're shared. On the autonomy point, you may be wondering, well, how can they be autonomous? And there is now startups exploring how you can actually use autonomous technology to better park and collect these vehicles. So you can address issues around the nuisances of people having left them on sidewalks. These services can also have an impact on the mobility. And the reason they can have an impact on mobility is if you look at how people use cars, a lot of the trip distances that people use for cars, you could actually replace with electric assist bicycles or stand-up scooters. Of course, you have to have the right infrastructure for it, and also the weather has to cooperate. In winter in Korea, yeah, nobody would probably want to be on an electric bicycle, but the other times when the weather is nice, you could actually rely on these modes. And this allows us to sort of unbundle the car with these modes. And already there's some statistics from places like San Francisco where they've had these shared scooters and bicycles on their roads, showing that the users that are relying on these modes, this is a survey of shared electric scooters in San Francisco, and they were asked, if this mode was not available, what would you use? And the modes that they answered, 41% of those modes would have been car-based. So this is showing you the potential for shared scooters and bicycles reducing demand for mobility from cars. There's also exciting things happening on flying cars. Now, this is another hot topic these days. I think when people talk about flying cars, maybe those of you who have seen the movie Back to the Future, you think about like the car that you drive for flying yourself. And that, of course, is good in terms of capturing the imagination of the average consumer. I had the opportunity to go to the Tokyo Motor Show, and the NEC flying car was, this was last week, and this was one of the most popular exhibits at the show. And the picture that you see on the right here, this is EHang, a Chinese startup that just filed for initial public offering in the US earlier this week. Now, why the idea of the average consumer using a flying car is quite exciting, we got to remember that actually the flying cars, what they are really good at is addressing segments of mobility where you really, really need fast response time. One of those is carrying organs. So you may not recognize this, but a lot of the ambulances that you need to see on the streets, they're not necessarily carrying injured people to the hospital. A lot of times what they're doing is they're actually carrying organs from one location to another. But that process is quite slow, and that process is actually quite time sensitive. So EHang, one of the major revenue streams that they have right now is actually signing up partnerships with hospitals in the US to help them with that organ carrying business. The reason I bring this up again is when you invent a new technology, you may want to think about what is the application that's going to be less price sensitive and will allow you to scale up faster. So in their case, they looked at this organ donation opportunity. So to summarize, there are three fundamental technologies that are helping drive the future mobility. One is electrified drivetrains. So that could be the battery and the fuel cell coupled with the inverters and the power electronics that you need and the motor. The other one is the connectivity. And the final one, of course, is the computation. Now, these elements, they're not exclusive to each other. And also, I want to point out that these elements, they both have hardware and software components. A lot of times, when I have the opportunity to talk to young students, they ask me, should I study more on software or hardware? If you have the opportunity, try to do both. One thing I want to point out, when people are fascinated nowadays with, for example, next generation batteries, solid-state batteries. Guess what? To design solid-state batteries, a lot of that actually relies on coming up with better molecular dynamic models that are all about computation. It's all about software. How you design a new electrode is all about that software technology. So these sort of innovations feed off each other. and they represent a lot of opportunity for new innovation. Now, for my last slide, I want to also point out that these transitions take a lot of time. I picked the example of the UK. UK is one of the countries where we could get statistics on transportation modes for the longest period of time in a consistent manner. The data you're looking at here shows you transport modes in Great Britain from 1950. You can see in 1950, about 20% of transport was being addressed by cars, and then about 30% of that was buses. Remember, this is 1950, more than 50 years after Carl Benz invented the car, right? And within that period, it only reached 20%. Now, of course, in the post-World War II economic boom, as income levels went higher and there was more affordable cars, you can see the share of the car go quite significantly higher. But you can see it still took a couple of decades to get sort of to the dominant point of 70–80%. So these transitions can take a lot of time. And the challenge we have today is we're actually a bit short on time. Now, why do I say we're a bit short of time? Hopefully, you all recognize the challenge that climate change represents. The two pictures that I put up here, actually, maybe I should ask, anyone recognize where these pictures are from? And these are very recent. Can you start? Very good. So the left one is in Japan, the right one is in California. The California picture, this is actually from last week. The Japan one is less than a week ago. The reason I picked these two pictures, so both of these are caused by natural disasters. So the Japan one, it was Typhoon Hagibis. This one is the California fires that happened recently. And while it's very hard to prove that climate change is responsible for any individual storm, so we should not, I'm not saying that climate change caused Typhoon Hagibis, but climate change does make the typhoons much more powerful and also makes their impact much more negative. The other reason I picked these two pictures is these are both transport infrastructure. So the left one, this is actually the Hokuriku Shinkansen that was unveiled just a few years ago. And this is the station in Nagano. And the station was flooded, and the line had to be shut down for quite a few days, and they won't be able to restart its full capacity for many months, actually. In the case of California, the most recent forest fires shut down I-5 and 405. These are some of the main highways going from Southern California to Northern California. So climate change is actually negatively impacting transportation infrastructure, but also greenhouse gas emissions from transportation are the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions after power sector. In cases of California, they're actually number one. So addressing emission from transportation is quite important. Now, while climate change is a very big challenge, it also represents a lot of opportunity for new innovation. And what I want to point out is, again, that innovation doesn't need to be necessarily some complex new hardware. The best recent innovations, Dr. Kim prior to me talked about Steve Jobs, they actually came from recognizing existing available technologies that can be applied in a new way. If you think about Apple, whether with the iMac or whether with the iPhone, to be fair, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, they were not the inventors of those technologies, but they managed to invent a new way of using those technologies. Thank you very much for your attention. Very good question, and it's true that we need to also address the power sector. Today, let's take the example of Korea. in the case of Korea, there's still a lot of the power is coming from coal. Even in the case of Korea, if you use an EV, your grams of CO2 per kilometer driven is still lower than burning gasoline in the car. And the main reason for that is the internal combustion engine vehicle is quite inefficient. In an internal combustion engine vehicle, if it's not a hybrid, the average efficiency around 33%. Electric motors are much more efficient. So even if the electricity source is thermal sources, you're still getting a little bit lower emissions than if you're using gasoline in a car. But of course, we need to also clean up the power sector. So the ideal scenario is if the electricity is generated from renewables.
Thank you, Ali.